I did my project in collaboration with Cascadia Research Collective, and the title of my project was Population Structure, Residency, and Inter-Island Movements of Common Bottlenose Dolphins off Oahu and Maui Nui. Let's see if, okay, there we go. And there were a lot of really wonderful people that helped me with putting this project together, and I just want to give a special shout out to my amazing advisors, Dr. Robin Baird from Cascadia Research, and Dr. John Kirkpatrick from the MES program here at Evergreen. So as mentioned, my project was looking at common bottlenose dolphins, and in particular, the Hawaiian resident species, or the Hawaiian resident populations of this species, which are federally protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. And these animals live in 4 independent island-associated populations in the main Hawaiian Islands, which are also designated as stocks for management purposes. And the boundaries of those stocks are shown in the map on the right. So from north to south, the stocks are centered around Kauai Ni'ihau, Oahu, Maui Nui, which is also known as the 4 Islands area, and Hawaii Island. And although there's a lot of variation here, the general rule of thumb I like to use is that there's about 100 or so animals per stock. Unfortunately, there is some evidence that these populations are in trouble. There has been declines in 3 out of the 4 stocks and lower than expected survival rates in all of the stocks. This is really driven by the fact that these animals have a distinct preference for shallow water, which brings them into close proximity of anthropogenic stressors, things like fisheries interactions, ship and boat traffic, pollution, noise, and nearshore habitat degradation. And the really important thing to know about those anthropogenic stressors is that they are spatially variable, meaning that they can differ in their degree of severity between different island areas. So a good management plan really has to be aware of which islands that the animals are using so that they can account for the different stressors that the animals are exposed to. The island areas that I focused on in particular for this study were Oahu and Maui Nui. And these 2 island areas are closer together than any of the other island areas in the main archipelago. They are connected by the Ka'iwi Channel, which is only 42 kilometers across and about 700 meters deep, which is much more shallow than the major channels connecting other island areas. Like the rest of the Hawaiian Islands, these island areas are oligotrophic, meaning that they have fairly low biological productivity, but they do have a lot of shallow water habitat, especially around Maui Nui. And a big chunk of that shallow water habitat in Maui Nui is created by this large shallow embankment to the southwest of Molokai called Penguin Bank. And the reason that I was interested in these particular island areas is because there have been occasional movements of bottlenose dolphins detected between these island areas, but until now, the significance of those movements has remained unknown. So the key research questions I wanted to ask were, do these movements between the Oahu and Maui Nui stocks significantly impact population structure? And what are the characteristics of the animals moving between stocks? And is there a seasonal trend to these movements? And to answer these questions, I turned to a Cascadia Research Collective dataset, which is the long-term bottlenose dolphin photo ID catalog. And the way this dataset works is it uses natural markings and scars on animals to track them over time and build sighting histories. And we can use this information to learn about social structure and spatial use. And an example of how this works is shown in the lower left portion of the screen, where this particular individual, identified by the large notch on the back of the fin, was first identified in 2012 off Oahu, then again in 2014 off Oahu, and most recently in 2020 off Lanai. And photos of bottlenose dolphins came from 2 main sources. First, from Cascadia, and these were survey efforts conducted over a number of years, track lines of which are shown as solid gray lines on the map on the right. And these were really extensive survey efforts. They covered over 20,000 kilometers and 1,000 hours during the study period I used. And another source of encounters was contributed photos from other researchers, from tour boat operators, and from scientists based in the islands. And those contributions really helped to expand the data set, making this a very robust study. Unfortunately, not all of the photos we got had GPS locations that came with them, but information about the nearest island was always available. From this data, I learned that out of the 492 animals identified off Oahu and Maui Nui, 14 of them used both island areas. So these were the inter-island animals. And sex information was available for 3 of those individuals, all of which were identified as females. I also noticed some interesting patterns in the spatial use of these animals. In the map on the right, the small blue-gray diamonds represent encounters with the inter-island animals, whereas the black dots represent all the remaining encounters. So you can see that those inter-island animals are really using Southwest Oahu, Southwest Molokai, and Southwest Lanai, but they're not really going into those insular waters inside of Maui Nui. And there was no obvious seasonal trend to these movement patterns. Encounters took place year-round with the inter-island animals in both island areas. So now that I knew that there was a geographic link between these populations, I wanted to know whether there was also a social link, and also just to learn a bit more about who these inter-island animals are. So I constructed a social network. And this is a graphic representation of the social relationships between animals, where each of the shapes, in this case, squares, triangles, and circles, represent individual animals. And lines connecting those shapes represent a social relationship between those individuals. And a social relationship in this case is defined based on a theory called the gambit of the group, which states that if you see 2 animals in the same group, they have a social relationship between them. So the first thing I noticed with this diagram was that there was a clear division between the Oahu and Maui Nui animals. Each of those island areas really clustered together to form these island area clusters. And in spite of there being almost 6,000 connections in the main clusters alone, only 2 linked the island areas together. And what this tells me is that any social relationship between these island areas is most likely negligible and not very important for population structure. I also learned that the 14 inter-island animals are most likely members of the Oahu population because they grouped within that Oahu cluster. And in this case, they represented about 5% of the Oahu animals identified in the study. Another data set I took advantage of was satellite tag data from 5 dolphins that were tagged by Cascadia. And these are small satellite tags. I have a picture of one in the lower right corner of the screen. And these tags just attach to the dorsal fin. And what they do is they provide really high quality location data over a short period of time, usually about 2 to 3 weeks before the tag stops transmitting or falls off. So track lines from these different tags are shown in the map on the left, and 2 tags were deployed onto animals from the Maui Nui population. And those are shown in orange and red. You can see these animals really stuck to the insular waters around Lanai and Maui. There was also 1 tag deployed onto an Oahu animal, and this animal stuck around the west and south coasts of Oahu. And what's really cool about this data is that there were also 2 tags deployed onto inter-island animals. Both of these animals were tagged off the west coast of Lanai, but they had very extensive movements. And 1 animal actually did move between islands while the tag was still attached. And the other important thing about spatial use that I learned from the satellite tag data is that the inter-island animals spent a lot of time on that shallow area to the southwest of Molokai, and that's Penguin Bank. And what that suggests is that that area is important for these inter-island animals. I also looked at the distribution of locations by depth for the different tagged animals, and I found some interesting differences. So the Maui Nui animals really seem to have a preference for shallow water, whereas the Oahu and inter-island animals spent a greater portion of their time in deep water. So up to this point, I still hadn't answered that key question that I wanted to know, which was, are these movements significant in terms of population structure? So in order to look at this, I calculated some interchange indices. And what these do is it essentially compares whether movements between areas are just as likely or less likely than movements within areas. And what I found overall is that movements between Oahu and Maui Nui are much less likely than movements within either of those areas. So in terms of population structure, these island areas should be considered separately because those inter-island movements just aren't really a definitive feature for those populations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't biologically significant. And when I broke things down to a sub-area level, I found some areas where movements between areas were actually significant. So between the shallow and deep waters off the west coast of Oahu and between the shallow and deep waters of Maui Nui, there was a significant degree of movement. And really interestingly, there was also a significant degree of movement between the west coast of Oahu and the deeper waters to the west of Lanai. So that's just really reinforcing this narrative that's been building to this point that there is movement between that west coast of Oahu and those deeper waters around Lanai, especially to the southwest. So in conclusion, I found that there were limited social connections between the Oahu and Maui Nui stocks, but that there was spatial overlap between these two stocks. And that was driven by a subset of the Oahu population that is moving between island areas. Now, these movements between island areas aren't as likely as movements within island areas, but again, that doesn't mean that they lack biological significance. And at the sub-area level, these movements actually are significant. And I found that inter-island travelers utilize Southwest Oahu, Southwest Molokai, Southwest Lanai, and Penguin Bank, but I wasn't able to identify any obvious seasonal drivers of inter-island movements or any of the possible ecological drivers, which is something that future research is going to have to look into. But really, the big key take-home point for this study was that the current management boundaries for the Oahu stock, which I showed all the way back at the beginning of the presentation, those boundaries are inadequate for management purposes because they fail to take into account that these Oahu animals are exposed to threats not only off of Oahu, but quite possibly off of Lanai and Molokai, which is something that really needs to be taken into account to ensure their proper conservation. So that is my talk. And with that, I would love to take any questions.